Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, opening knight of 3 and then c4, a very aggressive line of the ready opening versus the American Super GM Wesley So from the 2025 SuperUnited Rapid and Blitz Tournament. Let's see how this game unfolds, because in this game, Magnus here, he simply outplays Wesley So in a way that only the GOAT can do. All right, Wesley, his d-pawn is under attack. How does he want to respond? You can go, for example, d4 or d takes c4, but instead, Wesley, a very solid player as black, goes e6, bolstering the pawn on d5. From here, Magnus goes for his favorite Catalan style development with g3, bishop g2, and short castles. So g3, Wesley, knight f6, bishop g2, bishop b7, and then both sides do castle. We have castles and then castles. And now the big question here. Does Magnus want to go d4, heading straight for his new favorite opening as white, the Catalan, or does he want to do something else? For example, b3, d3, c takes d5, or any other number of ideas? Well, in the game, he goes b3. This is a very interesting sideline of the English, the idea being you bolster your pawn on c4, set up bishop b2 ideas, and so on. However, you don't put that much pressure on black's position, and here black has a number of decent ways to get an excellent game. For example, c5 is playable, b6 intending bishop b7 is playable, knight bd7 is playable, d4 is playable. There are a number of good ideas, and which one will Wesley So go for in the game? Well, he goes c5, gaining space, a solid idea. And here Magnus, again, he's got many ideas as well. Bishop b2, e3, knight c3, and so on are all playable, but instead, c takes d5 is the move, capturing on d5 with the pawn. Now, we have knight takes d5, and then knight to c3, offering the trade of knights if Wesley wants it. He could trade on c3, then trade on d1, exchanging queens off the board. Instead, knight to c6 is the move. Then bishop b2, and here finally Wesley, he does trade on c3. We have knight takes and then d takes. Now, very importantly, with the d file opened up here, either side could trade the queens like this. Instead, queen to c7 is the move for Wesley So. So Wesley trying to keep the queens on the board in this game. A very aggressive idea. All right. Magnus, queen c2, by far the best square for the queen. Black's rook is most likely heading for d8, therefore queen c2 makes a lot of sense right here. Now, Wesley, b6, sort of mirroring white setup, intending bishop b7, trying to challenge that light square bishop on g2. Logical idea, logical enough. Now, Magnus, rook a d1, and then bishop b7. So far, both sides putting all of their pieces on these very logical squares. Magnus with the double fianchetto setup, black, the fianchetto on b7, the other bishop on e7, and all of his pieces on pretty solid squares. And by all means, this position has to be roughly equal. I mean, white doesn't really have all that much. So how is Magnus going to slowly take over in this game? Well, it would not be a Magnus Carlsen game without him moving one of his pieces back to the first rank. And that's exactly what he does right here. Bishop to c1. I mean, this is a Magnus Carlsen move if I ever saw one. The idea is he retreats the piece, rerouting it to this diagonal, intending bishop f4, pressuring the queen. From there, the queen will have to move somewhere, or black can go, say, e5. But if black goes e5, then the pawn on e5 will be a little bit vulnerable, and Magnus may try to pressure it later in the game. So a fascinating idea. Black, rook a d8, the most natural move here for black, getting the rook on the open d file. But now, sure enough, bishop f4, pressuring the queen. And again, what does black want to do? You can go back to, say, c8, or you can go e5. But again, if you do go e5, it's a natural move. The problem is Magnus is going to have a field day slowly pressuring that pawn later in the game. So instead, Wesley trying to play safe and solid. He goes queen to c8, dropping back. But now, Magnus, knight g5, threatening checkmate in literally one move on h7. Sort of a beginner idea, but it's actually quite strong here. And what is black going to do in response? Obviously, h6 is no bueno, because then, bang, queen to h7 wins the game on the spot. You can't do that. If you go, say, g6, then your dark squares on the king side are permanently weakened. And then, for example, after g6, maybe knight to e6 looks good, eyeing h6, eyeing f6, and so on. And white's going to have, again, very good long-term play on the king side. Instead, in the game, Wesley, he takes on g5 with the bishop. Bishop takes g5, but the drawback of this move, white is going to win the bishop pair. And if there's one thing I know about Magnus Carlsen's games, you do not want to give this guy the bishop pair because he will slowly grind you down. Now, the computer here says actually f5 is the strongest move, but that move also looks very weakening. It seems to weaken e6 and other squares. So, I mean, it makes sense why Wesley in the game took on g5, but again, not a move you want to make versus Magnus. All right, now here we have bishop takes, attacks the rook on the d8 square, and Wesley f6 drives back the bishop, bishop f4, and then rook takes, and then rook d8. So Wesley trying to sort of trade off all the pieces off the board as fast as he can. His idea is simple. As more and more pieces come off the board, I'm one step closer to achieving a draw. But the one problem, again, Magnus, he has those two Bs, and Larry Kaufman and many other people have shown pretty convincingly that the two Bs are worth roughly half a pawn in most positions. Larry Kaufman being the inventor of the Komodo chess engine. This guy knows chess computers inside and out, and according to him and many other grandmasters, it's worth about half a pawn. Now, from here, Magnus, how does he want to increase the pressure? What's his idea? Well, you can trade on d8, but the problem with that is the queen recaptures, and suddenly Wesley has pretty much uncontested dominance of the open d file. So instead of that, Magnus, he plays the alpha 0 move h4, gaining space on the king side. A decent idea. First of all, you do give the king some loft on h2 if it needs it later in the game. There will not be any back rank mating threats. But beyond that, white may want to go h5, h6, trying to soften up the king side. If you do that, and then black goes, say, g6, the problem with that is the pawn on f6 will be permanently weakened, and the pawn on h6 will be a long-term asset for white. So, a very clever idea, giving black some problems to solve. Now, Wesley, e5 is the move, pressuring the bishop. But again, these pawns here, they can be attacked later, especially with the idea of h5, h6, trying to soften up all of these pawns. And beyond that, of course, this does weaken this critical diagonal. White can even go, for example, bishop d5, immediately pressuring the king on g8. All right, now, Magnus, bishop c1, retreats the bishop. Logical move. Now we have rook takes, queen takes, and then queen d8. Wesley, again, sticking to his plan, trying to trade off all the pieces off the board as quickly as he can, trying to get to an endgame. But again, you don't want to play an endgame versus Magnus with those two Bs. All right, Magnus, queen to d3. He does not trade queens yet. Instead, he gives Wesley the option of trading on d3, at which point he recaptures with the e-pawn, thereby potentially improving his pawn structure at least a little bit. And Wesley, he goes for it in a heartbeat. We have queen takes, then e takes, then knight d8, offering the bishop trade. Of course, if you trade bishops, black is one step closer to a draw. So instead, f3 is played here, blocking the long diagonal and giving the king the square f2 to jump up to. Now we have h5, king f2, king f7, and then bishop to h3. And from here, Magnus, what is his goal? Well, he sort of has to slowly but surely squeeze black, force out some weakening moves, force out potentially some pawn breaks, and try to allow these two Bs to just dominate on a soon-to-be open board. And Wesley, on the other hand, he really has to slowly defend. The knight in the endgame with pawns on both sides of the board is simply no match for either of the bishops. So black here is forced to passively defend for a very, very long time. All right, Wesley, knight e6, then f4, gaining some space. Knight c7. Then we have f takes and f takes. So now black has the very weak isolated pawn on e5, and white may have some ways to attack it later in the game. For example, potentially, I don't know, bishop b2, c4, or maybe bishop g5, bishop d8, c7, and so on. There may be some ways to pressure that pawn. Now, bishop b2, Magnus, setting up the idea of c4. Now, Wesley, knight b5, a3, g6, and then bishop d7, pressuring the knight. All right, knight d6, and then c4, pressuring the pawn. These two Bs slowly but surely getting to work in the endgame. Now, king to f6 is the move, b4 gaining space, king to e7, and then bishop to a4 sliding back and maintaining the tension. Now we have e4, Wesley trying to trade off some pawns, a good idea overall, but in response, bishop c2. Look at this. If you trade on d3, the bishop takes back and it pressures g6 like this. Ignore the bad arrow. And from there, these two Bs, I mean, we're going to dominate the entire board, and what can black possibly do to stop it? Well, black here, he trades on d3, we have bishop takes, and then a very strong move, bishop e4, offering the trade of bishops, and again, Magnus here, he declines. Bishop f1, then bishop f5, then we have b takes, and bishop c1. Magnus again retreating all the way back to the back rank, maybe intending, for example, bishop to e3 or f4, targeting these two pieces here. And again, the two Bs, they're going to slowly but surely get to work in the endgame. All right, bishop e6, pressuring c4, and this pawn here, it cannot be defended. So what is white going to do? Well, he counterattacks on the pawn on c5. The point being, if black trades here, white can always trade back on c5, pressuring a7 and so on, and white will still have at least a little bit of an edge in the endgame. All right, now black here. It turns out your best course of action is to ignore the pawns and simply go king to f6 or d7. Instead, Wesley, he trades on c4, he thinks it's the right idea, but it turns out this is the beginning of the end for Wesley. Now here, Magnus, bishop g2, keeping those two Bs alive at all costs. And of course, if black tries to go, say, knight b7 or knight e4, defending c5, either move would lose the knight as the bishop controls both e4 and b7, among other squares. Now, black, the move is a6. The idea is if white takes on c5, then the pawn on a6 will not be under attack by the bishop. But it turns out this move is another little weakening move. And white here takes on c5 and pins that knight on d6 to the king on the e7 square. Now, we have king e6, king to e3, knight to f5 attacks the king as well as the pawn on g3. Now, king to f4 defends the king and g3 in one go. We have bishop d3. Bishop b4, bishop b5, and from here, both sides are sort of sharking around. Neither side really committing to a plan. Wesley, he's fine with a draw. He's a little bit worse. So Magnus here, he's got to find some way to break through. What will the idea be? Well, both sides continue sharking around. Magnus trying to pressure g6. Black defends with the bishop by moving the knight. Bishop f6 attacks the king, king to f8, and so on. Magnus here slowly but surely pressuring around, so far not able to get anything done until all the way up here in this position, black finally goes g5, thinking it's the right idea, but it turns out it is not. Instead, knight to d6 was the right defense. Instead, g5, and Magnus here, he goes bishop to d1, attacking the new weakness on h5. We have g takes, knight to f6, trying to defend, but now bishop e2 attacks this pawn, and the bishop on c7 controls a5, meaning there is simply no escape. That pawn will be falling. All right. Knight e8 attacks the bishop, bishop e5. Then here, knight d6, another little mistake. Instead, a5 now is the right response. Instead, knight d6, and here, Magnus, he takes on d6, black takes back, and then simply bishop takes a6, winning this pawn, that being the correct pawn, as the bishop controls a8. It does not control h8. Therefore, this is the pawn you want in the endgame. All right. Bishop g6, Magnus here, he's up the pawn. Can he convert it to a victory? Let's see. a4, king to c6, then a5, bishop f5, bishop e2, attacks h5 again. Then bishop c8, king to e5, king to c5, bishop takes h5, bishop a6, and now bishop to f3. And in this position, Wesley So, he simply resigns on the spot to Magnus, and here's why. There's simply no way to defend against both of these pawns from promoting Magnus here is going to win in short order, and according to the engine, white is completely winning, therefore Wesley So resigning at exactly the right time in this game. Wow, what a game between Magnus and Wesley So in the 2025 SuperUnited Croatia Rapid and Blitz Tournament. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please smash that YouTube like button. It really does help me out a ton with reaching more people online. So please smash that like button and comment down below what you thought of this crazy game between Magnus and Wesley So. And as always, I wish you the best of luck in your chess improvement journey in 2025 and beyond. And I'll see you in the next video.